The winter of 1943 had tightened its grip on the North Atlantic. Snow and sleet whipped across the decks of British and American ships, forming Convoy HX 229, a seemingly routine merchant fleet steaming from New York to Liverpool. But this convoy wasn't ordinary. Among its 40 cargo vessels were crates marked only with coded serials, highly classified radar components that, if delivered safely, could change the tide of the war against the U-boats lurking beneath them. The date was March 15, 1943. To the men aboard, it was just another perilous crossing, part of the endless rhythm of supply and survival. The Allied convoys were the arteries of Britain's resistance, but the North Atlantic was a graveyard. Every sailor knew it. The men of the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy Escort Group, destroyers like HMS Harvester, HMS Air, and the American USS Bowery, watched the dark waters with a mix of fear and determination. Somewhere below, Admiral Karl Donit's wolf packs were waiting. The convoy had been assembled under tight secrecy. Orders came from Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. No radio transmissions unless absolutely necessary. Even the ship captains weren't told the full nature of their cargo. But rumors spread quickly at sea. "They say we're carrying something the Germans would kill for," one seaman whispered. "Something that sees through fog and night alike." The sea was merciless that week. Gale-force winds battered the merchantmen as they pushed eastward into what sailors grimly called the Black Pit, a stretch of ocean too far for Allied air cover. Radar screens flickered with static. The escorts strained to maintain formation through towering waves and freezing spray. The men barely slept. Every thump beneath the hull could be a mine, or worse. At 0300 hours on March 17th, the convoy's radio operator, Petty Officer Alan Graves, logged a final entry. Asterisk, signals jammed, shadows on the surface. Asterisk, minutes later, his ship, the SS Empire Trader, vanished from the formation. No distress call, no flares, just gone. HMS Harvester doubled back, sweeping the area with sonar, but picked up nothing but echoes and interference. Some believed the heavy seas had swallowed the freighter hull. Others whispered of something far more coordinated, a trap carefully laid by Donit's submarines. For those still steaming east, the fear was palpable. Men spoke little, keeping their eyes fixed on the black horizon. Convoy Commodore Captain John Dowding later wrote in his after-action report, asterisk, morale was strained to breaking point. The men could feel something closing in. It was not imagination. Asterisk, the struggle wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Germans had learned to jam Allied radar and mimic radio signals, creating confusion among the escorts. Orders came and went over the ether, some authentic, others forged. As one officer aboard the Harvester recalled in his diary, asterisk, we began to doubt our own instruments. Friend and foe blurred into the same fog. Asterisk, that uncertainty would prove fatal. The Empire Trader was never found, and its disappearance marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in the Battle of the Atlantic. When questioned weeks later, survivors from another damaged freighter swore they'd seen faint lights beneath the waves, perhaps the glow of U-boat periscopes or something else entirely. Yet official reports dismissed these as illusions caused by stress and fatigue. Still, one line from Graves' last log entry puzzled investigators. Asterisk, shadows on the surface. Asterisk, in post-war archives, this fragment appeared repeatedly in Admiralty records, always redacted in the same places. What had he seen in those final moments? A surfaced U-boat preparing an attack, or a friendly escort, misidentified in the chaos? The historian Stephen Roskill would later write, in the Atlantic War, information was as deadly as torpedoes. Knowing what the enemy knew, and what he didn't, was the difference between survival and silence. Even today, some naval researchers argue that Convoy HX 229 was being shadowed not only by German submarines, but by Allied intelligence vessels running parallel, monitoring radar interference experiments. If true, it means Graves' convoy may have been more than a supply run. It was part of a larger, secret operation to test prototype radar jamming systems. An experiment that might have gone catastrophically wrong. As the battered convoy pushed eastward into rougher seas, the men knew little of what was unfolding around them. To them, It was just another crossing through hell, until the ocean itself began to swallow their ships. By dawn on March 18th, the wind had eased. A few wreckage fragments, oil drums, a lifebuoy marked Empire Trader, and a broken crate with scrambled cereals floated in the gray water. HMS Harvester retrieved what they could. Inside one of the waterlogged notebooks was a single line, barely legible. Asterisk, they knew we were coming. Asterisk, the convoy continued toward Britain, reduced but resolute. Yet the fear remained, a sense that something unseen had marked them from the start. The secret cargo was still aboard, still hidden, still moving toward its unknown fate. And somewhere beyond the mist, a silent periscope broke the surface, tracking every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the night of March 18th, 1943, the storm had eased, but the silence that followed was worse. Convoy HX 229, still reeling from the unexplained loss of the Empire Trader, pressed deeper into the Atlantic's deadliest corridor. The men called it the Gap, a void between Newfoundland and Ireland where no Allied aircraft could reach. Out here, they were alone, blind, and being hunted. The escort commander, Captain Arthur Tate, aboard HMS Harvester, gathered his officers in the radio room. "We're being tracked," he said grimly. "Signals are off, but they're still finding us." Unknown to him, German Admiral Karl Donitz had unleashed one of his largest wolf packs yet, *Robgraf*, consisting of more than a dozen U-boats spread across the convoy's route. Their orders: strike at dawn. At 0430 hours, the radar on HMS Air flickered to life. Blips appeared, then vanished. Phantom contacts. Lieutenant William Mac McCall, the ship's radar operator, adjusted the dials, convinced it was interference. "We hear them before we see them," he muttered to his captain. Then silence. Seconds later, the sonar picked up a chilling sound, the rhythmic thump of diesel engines below. The convoy's defensive formation snapped into action. The British destroyers Harvester, Air, and the American USS Bowery fanned out, launching flares into the night sky. For a brief, terrible moment, the black ocean lit up like lightning. Whitewakes cut through the waves, torpedoes. The first hit came at 0445. The SS LNK, a Norwegian tanker, erupted into flames, its fuel cargo turning the sea into a burning mirror. Men scrambled to lifeboats, but the heat was unbearable. The sea itself burned, one survivor later said. Tate ordered aggressive depth charge runs. The Harvester roared through the fire, dropping patterns of explosives that shook the sea. One detonation brought oil and debris bubbling to the surface, confirmation of at least one U-boat destroyed. But even as the crew cheered, another torpedo slammed into the SS Kingman, breaking her in two. The wolf pack was attacking from every angle. The tactical nightmare was compounded by something far more sinister: communications failure. Allied ships reported strange distortions in their radio frequencies. Messages from Western Approach's command were delayed or scrambled beyond recognition. Some captains received orders that contradicted their standing instructions. "Hold position," one message read. "Sign under a code, name no one recognized." It was later proven that the Germans had begun using captured Allied frequencies to transmit false commands. In the chaos, convoy discipline broke down. The merchantmen began to scatter, forming small clusters that only made them easier targets. HMS Harvester and USS Bowery tried desperately to regroup them, their signal lamps flashing through smoke and spray. But by sunrise, 5 ships were gone. Another 3 were heavily damaged and adrift. In his private notes, McCall wrote, "We are fighting ghosts. They strike, vanish, and we chase their echoes." The escorts deployed the new Type 271 radar system, experimental and unreliable in rough seas, but it offered their only chance. Using it, Air managed to lock onto a contact just 500 yards off the port bow. A periscope flash confirmed it. U-boat on the surface. The destroyer charged, ramming at full speed. The impact tore a hole in Air's bow, but the U-boat, later identified as U-600, was forced under and never resurfaced. Still, the sense of victory was hollow. For every submarine they hit, 2 more seemed to appear. The wolf pack had learned to work in silence, coordinating attacks without radio signals by using prearranged navigation grids. Each submarine would surface briefly under cover of night, plotting intercept courses based on estimated convoy positions. The Allies called this the Shadow Dance, and that night, the dance turned deadly. Captain Tate, exhausted but unflinching, scribbled a single note in his log before dawn. Asterisk, we are surrounded. They know our course. Someone must have told them. Asterisk, it was a chilling thought, one that echoed through every surviving ship in the convoy. Had their route been compromised? Some officers whispered that the Germans had cracked another Allied code. Others suspected a leak within the convoy itself. A traitor aboard one of the merchant ships, sending position signals disguised as cargo transmissions. The Admiralty would later redact large sections of these reports, citing operational secrecy. As the battered convoy limped eastward, the men barely had time to bury their dead. The smell of oil and burnt steel clung to every deck. Yet amid the loss, there was resolve. The radar operators kept scanning, the gunners stood watch, and the engines churned on. They were determined to reach Liverpool, no matter the cost. By the second night, the sea had grown calm again. A deceptive peace. The escorts reduced speed to regroup. Over the radio, faint Morse signals crackled. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. An SOS, but from whom? No ship admitted sending it. It was repeated twice, then silence. When HMS Harvester tried to trace it, all they found were ripples in the radar. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new, invisible phase, one where information warfare would prove deadlier than torpedoes. The men didn't know it yet, but the next attack would not only sink ships, it would erase one from history entirely. Somewhere out in the darkness, a German captain watched through his periscope, recording his final entry before striking. Asterisk, convoy in sight. Orders confirmed. The one we seek is among them. Asterisk, moments later, the Atlantic exploded. When dawn broke on March 19th, 1943, the horizon was littered with wreckage and smoke. The survivors of Convoy HX 229 were still reeling from the previous night's carnage. In the pale light of morning, they discovered another ship missing. The convoy's lead freighter, SS Fort Cedarwood. It had vanished sometime before dawn, without distress calls, without debris. The ship that carried the most heavily guarded cargo of the entire fleet had simply ceased to exist. Captain Tate, aboard HMS Harvester, was incredulous. A ship that size doesn't just disappear, he snapped at his officers. The Fort Cedarwood was a Canadian-built merchant vessel, 7,200 tons, fitted with extra communications gear and an unusually high number of armed guards for a freighter. According to the manifest, she carried radar components, encryption devices, and other classified technology. But there was something else, something no one could confirm. Her cargo section was sealed, and only her captain held the access codes. The disappearance ignited chaos among the escorts. HMS Air and USS Bowery conducted sonar sweeps, but the sea gave back nothing. No oil slick, no floating crates, no bodies. Just a dense fog rolling in from the north. Tate ordered a full radio silence until further notice, suspecting that their transmissions might be tracked. The tension on deck was unbearable. Men whispered about the ghost ship, the Fort Cedarwood that had sailed into the mist and never come out. Behind the scenes, however, Admiralty intelligence had known the risks. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts had intercepted a German Enigma message just days earlier, one that mentioned Operation Sturmir and a special target within HX 229. But the decision was made not to warn the convoy. The source of the intelligence was too valuable to reveal. Sending a direct warning might expose the Allies' ability to break Enigma. It was a grim calculation. Sacrifice a few ships to protect a secret that could win the war. As historian Ralph Bennett later wrote, there are moments when knowledge becomes as dangerous as ignorance. Bletchley could save ships, but not without risking the entire code-breaking effort. Meanwhile, rumors spread among the crew. One story claimed that a German U-boat had surfaced alongside Fort Cedarwood, signaling her in Morse before she vanished. Another said her captain had broken formation on secret orders. In the confusion, no one knew what to believe. Lieutenant McCall, the radar officer from Air, noted in his journal, asterisk, orders never logged, messages never received. Someone's lying, but who? Asterisk the fog thickened throughout the day, swallowing what was left of the convoy. By evening, visibility was less than 100 yards. The escorts moved by sound and instinct, their sonar pings echoing across the black water. At 2,200 hours, WWII detected a contact directly ahead. Then two more, flanking her position. It was an ambush. The wolf pack had found them again. Depth charges thundered through the night. One detonation rocked air so violently that her power failed, leaving her blind in the water. The only light came from burning oil on the surface, painting the waves in sickly orange. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. No more torpedoes, no more contacts, just silence and the groan of the wind. When the systems came back online, AIR's radar picked up a faint echo, far to the east, moving slowly, alone. It matched the size and speed of Fort Cedarwood. HMS Harvester turned to pursue, but before she could close the distance, the signal faded into static. It was as if the freighter had vanished again, swallowed by the very sea she sailed on. Weeks later, when the Admiralty reviewed the after-action reports, something curious emerged. In one section of the decrypted German naval archives, there was mention of a ship of interest intercepted in the Atlantic carrying Anglo-American equipment of strategic value. But no U-boat was credited with the sinking. The entry ended abruptly with the phrase, "contact lost. Silence maintained." What truly happened to Fort Cedarwood remains one of the Atlantic's great mysteries. Some historians believe she was sunk by a U-boat whose log was destroyed in the chaos of the war. Others suspect she was deliberately diverted, sent to a different rendezvous point under secret orders from British intelligence. Supporting this theory, fragments of her cargo, marked with matching serial codes, were later found in a classified RAF research report from 1944. Yet the human toll of the convoy could not be so easily erased. Dozens of sailors were lost. Their families never told the full story. For those who survived, the memory of that fog-shrouded night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Captain Tate wrote one final entry before the convoy reached British waters. The enemy knew our course, our timing, and our cargo. But so did someone else. I can't help but think this was no mere attack. It was a test. His words would later be sealed in Admiralty archives under restricted HX 229 incident. It would take decades for historians to even learn the name Fort Cedarwood, and by then, the trail had already gone cold. As the surviving ships limped toward Liverpool, one final radio transmission crackled through the static, an automated beacon repeating every 30 seconds. Cedarwood, standing by. The signal was traced, triangulated, and then gone. No one ever heard it again. By the time Convoy HX 229 reached the approaches to Ireland in late March 1943, the survivors were ghosts of their former selves. Salt-crusted, sleep-deprived, and hollow-eyed, they had endured storms, torpedoes, and vanishing ships. Yet the disappearance of the Fort Cedarwood haunted them most of all. The official reports listed her as lost to enemy action, but no wreckage was ever confirmed. To the men who had sailed with her, the explanation rang hollow. At Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, Rear Admiral Robert Burnett convened a debriefing in a dimly lit war room thick with cigarette smoke. On the table lay a chart of the convoy's route, each position marked in pencil, each loss circled in red. Too many ships went down without contact reports, Burnett said, his voice taut, and we have no verified kills. It's as though the U-boats knew exactly where to strike. Across from him sat intelligence officers from the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center and an observer from Bletchley Park, there to ensure certain topics remained untouched. HMS Harvester's Captain Tate was called in to testify. He described how the convoy's radio traffic had been jammed, how orders seemed to arrive late or altered, and how the radar interference had worsened just before each attack. We thought it was German countermeasures, Tate explained, but the patterns were irregular, almost as if they were testing our response. The Bletchley man exchanged glances with Burnett, but said nothing. Later analysis revealed something odd. The convoy's recorded coordinates differed by nearly 60 nautical miles from where survivors were actually found. Some theorize a navigational error due to magnetic anomalies or damaged compasses. Others, more skeptical, suspected intentional rerouting. A decrypted U-boat log fragment mentioned. Course altered by signal. New intercept point achieved. Yet Allied archives showed no record of such a signal being sent. When Harvester's crew was interviewed, several officers insisted they had seen a coded message flash through the fog from a nearby merchant vessel shortly before Fort Cedarwood disappeared. The signal, 3 long flashes, 2 short, didn't match any Allied recognition codes. The ship sending it could not be identified. The Admiralty classified the claim as unsubstantiated due to stress and atmospheric interference. But privately, Burnett ordered a separate investigation into the possibility of espionage within the convoy. Out at sea, divers and rescue teams scoured the area for days. All they found were fragments, a section of hull plating, a life buoy with half the lettering burned away, and a crate lid stamped with faint numerals. *RDF/72 B*. It matched Fort Cedarwood's manifest. Yet sonar scans revealed no wreck below. The debris seemed scattered, as if deliberately jettisoned. It looked staged, one diver reported, as if someone wanted us to think she went down there. Amid the confusion, conflicting reports poured in from other convoys operating nearby. Several captains claimed to have picked up faint, distorted radio calls using Fort Cedarwood's identifier, originating hundreds of miles away. One was logged by a Canadian corvette in Convoy on 175, Cedarwood holding course. No escort in sight. By the time British signals intelligence attempted to trace it, the transmission had faded into static. This growing mystery created deep unease within the Admiralty. A memo dated March 25, 1943, marked most secret, stated, "Do not pursue inquiries into vessel Fort Cedarwood. Ship may have been reassigned under special directive. Further discussion restricted to authorized personnel." It was signed by an undersecretary from the Ministry of Supply, not the Navy. Why the Ministry of Supply, a department concerned with war materials, was involved in a naval incident baffled Burnett and his officers. For decades afterward, researchers would piece together fragments suggesting that the Fort Cedarwood had been diverted to participate in an experimental radar deception program known as Operation Enfield. The operation allegedly sought to test long-range jamming and false target projection using merchant vessels as mobile transmitters. If true, it would explain the erratic radar returns, the altered signals, and the strict secrecy surrounding the cargo. It would also mean the ship's disappearance was no accident. It was part of a planned test that spiraled out of control. In a private letter to his wife, written just before his death in 1944, Captain Tay confessed, "I believe we were pawns in something far greater than the convoy war. We were bait, perhaps, or witnesses best forgotten." His widow donated the letter to the Imperial War Museum years later, but much of it remains redacted. The official British narrative stayed unchanged. HX 229 suffered heavy losses due to coordinated U-boat attack. Fort Cedarwood, they said, went down with all hands somewhere between Greenland and Ireland. Yet sailors who survived that crossing insisted otherwise. "You can feel it," one petty officer said in a BBC interview decades later. "She wasn't sunk. She left us. We just don't know where she went." As post-war technology advanced, oceanographers and historians began mapping the seabed of the North Atlantic using side-scan sonar. In the 1970s, one team claimed to detect a wreck roughly matching Fort Cedarwood's dimensions, but located nearly 300 miles north of her last recorded position. The coordinates were quickly classified by the Ministry of Defense and never released. The sea, it seemed, wasn't ready to give up its secrets. In 1943, however, all that mattered was survival. With the convoy reduced to half its strength, HMS Harvester turned homeward, her hull scarred and crew broken. As they crossed into safer waters, a final signal arrived from Western Approach's command. One line only. Maintain silence. Debrief upon arrival. Cedarwood, not to be mentioned. Tate folded the message, locked it in his journal, and looked out across the gray, endless Atlantic. Somewhere out there, he knew, The truth was drifting, buried beneath the waves or hidden behind classified doors. The war moved on, but the questions didn't. And soon, new evidence would emerge that Fort Cedarwood's disappearance was only the beginning. By May 1943, the tide of the Atlantic War had begun to turn. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were dismantling Admiral Donit's once dreaded wolf packs one by one, and air cover had finally begun to close the notorious Black Pit. But for those who had sailed with Convoy HX 229, the scars remained. HMS Harvester limped into Liverpool with barely half her original escort complement, her crew silent, her captain's eyes hollow. The name Fort Cedarwood was never spoken aloud again, at least not officially. The Admiralty filed the incident under standard losses due to enemy action. Yet behind locked doors, a different story unfolded. In late April, a classified U.S. Navy memorandum, declassified decades later, revealed that American naval intelligence had taken a keen interest in the missing freighter. The memo, marked eyes only, contained one cryptic line: Cedarwood may have carried unauthorized transmitter. Further investigation required. That line set off quiet alarm bells on both sides of the Atlantic. The Americans had contributed several experimental radar components to the Fort Cedarwood's cargo, including early prototypes of the cavity magnetron, the heart of the Allies' microwave radar. Its loss, if true, meant one of the most valuable wartime technologies could have fallen into enemy hands or vanished altogether. Investigators from both the U.S. Navy and Britain's Ministry of Supply combed through communications logs, convoy charts, and survivor testimony. What they found was maddeningly inconsistent. Some logs placed Fort Cedarwood at the convoy center when she disappeared. Others recorded her veering off to starboard, as if following independent orders. Even the ship's captain, James Corbett, had an unusual background for a merchant skipper. He'd served briefly with British naval intelligence before being reassigned to convoy duty. Not the kind of man you lose track of by accident, one investigator later wrote. Then came a discovery that deepened the mystery further. In late May, fishermen off the coast of Iceland recovered a sealed steel container drifting in the current. Inside were charred papers, a corroded key, and a fragment of a code book bearing the faint words, property of HM Transport Fort Cedarwood. Among the scorched remains was a single legible entry. Signal from control received. Alternate destination confirmed. Proceed under silence. It was the first concrete evidence suggesting the ship had been deliberately diverted. Still, no one could agree who control was. The Ministry of Supply denied any involvement, insisting that the Fort Cedarwood had no experimental purpose beyond carrying radar components. Bletchley Park's records, when later examined, showed no direct intercepts or decrypts mentioning the vessel after her disappearance. Yet in a marginal note, a codebreaker had scribbled a cryptic comment, Fort C, tied to Enfield Op, terminated prematurely. Operation Enfield, the rumored radar deception program, surfaced again. The theory went that Fort Cedarwood had been fitted with a prototype transmitter capable of creating false radar echoes, designed to confuse U-boats tracking convoys. The mission may have required her to break formation and broadcast from separate location, testing the system under live conditions. If the equipment malfunctioned, it could have disrupted Allied radar instead, explaining the bizarre interference that plagued HX 229. A handful of historians believe the Cedarwood never sank at all. Instead, they argue she was redirected to a secret Allied testing site in Greenland or the Shetland Islands, where her crew may have been sworn to silence or reassigned under new identities. Supporting this theory, a U.S. Navy engineer, Commander Robert Mills, testified after the war that a Canadian freighter carrying classified radar had completed a covert jamming trial in spring '43 and was scuttled to maintain secrecy. No ship was named, but the date matched perfectly. Others reject this version, arguing it's impossible that so many men could simply vanish without a trace. Yet even official archives lend weight to the secrecy. One Admiralty document titled Convoy HX 229 After Action Review include a redacted appendix labeled only Special Consignment, not for record. When unclassified portions were released in the 1980s, That appendix was missing entirely. For the families of the lost sailors, no explanation could fill the void. Widows received form letters citing hostile engagement. No graves. No answers. One mother, whose son had served as a radio operator aboard Fort Cedarwood, wrote to the Admiralty for years. Her final letter, dated 1950, pleaded simply, *, please tell me if my boy was lost at sea or if he never left England at all. *, she never received a reply. Captain Tate's own fate mirrored the enigma of the ship he'd escorted. Weeks after his debriefing, HMS Harvester was ordered back to sea. In March 1943, she engaged and sank U-444. But moments later, she herself was struck by a torpedo from U-432. She went down with 149 men. Tate's logbooks, including his entries about Fort Cedarwood, were lost with him. From that point forward, the incident faded from wartime memory. Official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic mention HX-229 only in passing, a costly but routine engagement. But for those who've studied it closely, the inconsistencies stand out like flares in the dark. As one historian later summarized, *, the truth about Convoy HX-229 is not that a ship vanished. It's that someone wanted it to. *, and perhaps most chilling of all, fragments of Fort Cedarwood's cargo reappear a year later in a different report, this time from an RAF radar station in Lincolnshire. The parts were logged as untraceable source, believed North Atlantic recovery. No one could, or would, explain how they got there. The war was turning in the Allies' favor, but some victories carried hidden prices. The mystery of the Fort Cedarwood was buried under layers of secrecy, deception, and classified reports, sealed away as if to protect not the living, but the truth itself. As the historian Corelli Barnett later wrote, "In war, what's lost beneath the sea is often less troubling than what's buried in the archives." And in this case, both lay silent, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up. Decades passed before the North Atlantic began to whisper its secrets again. By the early 1980s, sonar technology had advanced enough for researchers to map the seabed between Greenland and Ireland, the same corridor where Convoy HX-229 had fought and bled in 1943. Among the twisted remnants of U-boats and merchant wrecks, one anomaly stood out. A large metallic hull resting nearly 300 miles north of the Convoy's last recorded position. Its dimensions, rivet pattern, and hull plating matched the Fort Cedarwood. But something didn't fit. The ship's serial numbers, faintly visible on corroded steel, didn't align with any vessel officially registered during the war. Either the ship's identity had been altered, or the records had. When divers descended in 1984, they reported an eerie scene. The freighter's hatches sealed from the inside, no evidence of combat damage, and an unusual lattice of wires running through the cargo hold. The cargo compartments themselves had been stripped bare. The British Ministry of Defense immediately classified the discovery. Officially, the wreck was unidentified and of no historical interest. Yet within months, the research team's photographs and sonar logs disappeared from their archives. A journalist with the Times, Malcolm Turner, who had been following the story, later claimed he was warned to leave naval matters alone. In a 1987 radio interview, Turner said quietly, "If the Fort Cedarwood was meant to vanish, then she's still doing her job." Modern analysts who have examined the surviving sonar scans noticed that the wreck sits beside what appears to be a smaller structure, possibly a submarine or a supply vessel. Some speculate it might be a German U-boat that attempted to board or tow the Cedarwood. Others think it was an Allied escort sent to scuttle her. No bodies were ever recovered, and no records match the second hull's shape. Whatever happened out there, both vessels rest in silence, locked in the cold embrace of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, declassified Admiralty documents have deepened rather than solved the mystery. One file released under the British Freedom of Information Act in 2004 included a memo dated May 1943. *, infield trial suspended. Remaining assets secured. Recommend disposal of vessel per standing directive. It was signed not by a naval officer, but by a Ministry of Supply official. Proof that the Fort Cedarwood's mission was tied to the secret radar deception program. The disposal order, historians argue, may have referred to the deliberate sinking of the ship to prevent German capture. or to erase all evidence of the technology she carried. Today, marine archaeologists still survey the area periodically. They find traces of metal debris drifting miles from the main wreck, as if the ship disintegrated slowly over time, rather than exploding. Magnetic anomalies near the site suggest residual electrical equipment, possibly remnants of the transmitter that once jammed both Allied and German radar. Yet the ocean guards its truths well. To many naval historians, Fort Cedarwood stands as a symbol of wartime secrecy, the moment when intelligence, technology, and morality collided beneath the waves. In war, wrote historian Stephen Roskill, truth is seldom sunk by torpedoes, but by silence. The story of Convoy HX 229 is not only a tale of loss at sea, it is a reminder of how far governments will go to protect an advantage, and how easily men and ships can be erased from the record in the process. For veterans who survived the convoy, the memories never faded. In interviews recorded in the 1990s, several recalled the eerie radio message that haunted them still. Cedarwood, standing by. One described hearing it faintly through static days after reaching Liverpool. It wasn't a voice, he said, just the pulse of a signal like a heartbeat. That faint pulse, historians believe, may have been a malfunctioning distress beacon, or perhaps a deliberate transmission meant to divert attention elsewhere. Either way, it became the convoy's ghost, echoing through the years as proof that the ship, and the truth, had once existed. In 2010, oceanographic researchers attempted one final expedition to the coordinates of the wreck. Severe weather forced them to abandon the dive. Before turning back, their sonar operator captured a final image, a blurred silhouette lying beneath silt and ice. The data tag read simply, unidentified, depth 3,420 meters. Somewhere in that cold, eternal darkness rests a ship that was never supposed to be found, carrying secrets meant never to resurface. The official story will always say she was lost to U-boats, another casualty of the Battle of the Atlantic. But the classified memos, the altered records, and the silent wreck tell a different story, one of secrecy, sacrifice, and disappearance. 80 years later, the Fort Cedarwood remains both monument and mystery. Her engines have long been silent, but her story still moves beneath the surface, a reminder that in the vastness of war, some truths are meant to sink and never rise again.